Hello, welcome to this webinar then, and I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21, and this is one of the several webinars we do with the Give Us a Chance Consortium GUAC, which helps to provide information and good practice amongst the associations that are associated with the GUAC consortium. And that's great because lots of housing associations and social landlords are doing a tremendous amount of good things, and it's worth exchanging that good practice. And we also invite people on who tell us about changes that are happening. And one of the changes that's happening and is very imminent is the Apprenticeship Levy. And we've got Paul Warner, who you can see here, who in a minute is going to come on and tell us about that. But first of all, let me just say that you have a chat box on your right-hand side. Please type into that any questions or any comments you've got, and that should be fine. Alan says there's no audio, but if there's anyone else who says there's a problem with the audio, then please tell me. But it says here that everything is fine and the audio is going. And I know that Ian and that Paul can hear me. Okay. Right, so let's start then by just asking Ian about GUAC itself, because this is, as I say, one of the many webinars that we're doing with GUAC, and the Give Us a Chance Consortium is an incredibly useful organisation for social landlords, for actually involving them in a lot of activities about exchanging good practice, about lobbying government and so on. So Ian, do you want to briefly tell us a bit about GUAC for those who don't know, though I'm sure many do?
Yeah, more than everybody. Thank you, Francis, and thanks very much, Paul, for coming on to the webinar this morning. From Give Us a Chance's perspective, people will appreciate it, but I'm helping primarily customers of housing providers into employment, and apprenticeships is a big part of that for us. Obviously, there's an element for us as housing providers, as employers, and apprenticeships for people that work within our organisations. I think us that are on this webinar this morning are particularly interested to learn from Paul around how we can use the Apprenticeship Levy to create opportunities to get more of our customers into jobs. Jobs for customers is important, but also skills and increased skills leading to increased and more sustainable employment for our customers is a massive opportunity for us. And I am keen to learn more, and we hear stuff all the time about the levy, and I know Paul talks about learn more. We hear about it all the time. It's about us understanding how we can get heads around this and make it work for us. So I hope that makes sense, and thank you everybody for your attention this morning.
Okay, thanks, Ian, and thank you for the chance for people to see these webinars, which is great. Anyhow, today we're going to look at the Apprenticeship Levy, and this begins on April the 6th, and it applies to all employers with a pay bill of over £3 million, and the levy is about 0.5% a month. And obviously that's going to concern lots of housing associations and employers in both the private and the public sector, because they're going to want to know how they assess how much they pay. They're going to want to know how they look at this against their total budget. And we've got Paul here to help us. Now, Paul is a person who's had a great experience in this. He's been a consultant, trainer. He is also the director of research and development in the Association of Employment and Learning Providers. And I should also add, he likes rock music, amateur dramatics, and he is training for a black belt in karate. But don't let that stop you asking him any awkward questions. Anyhow, Paul, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to go over to you now and make your presentation so you can take us through the Apprenticeship Levy and how it will affect social landlords.
Okay, thank you very much, Francis, and morning to everybody. I shall just do my best to get engaged with the technology, and hopefully you should be sharing my screen any moment now. Yep, is that up there? Is that all okay?
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Good. Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity to come on and talk to you today about the Apprenticeship Levy. For those of you that don't know us, AELP, Association of Employment and Learning Providers, is the major trade body for work-based learning organisations, We have about 800 members all over England, and about 90% of them have got apprenticeships as a major part of what they're doing. So obviously we've been very involved in the development of this policy excuse me, over the last couple of years, really, as it's been coming forward. So hopefully should be able to take you through quite a lot of information today. Very pleased to be able to be working with GUAC on a number of levels, actually. These are sort of reciprocal webinars. GUAC have done some webinars for us on work of housing associations before, and we like to try and work alongside them wherever possible. So I'm very pleased to be able to have the opportunity to do this today. There is an awful lot of information to get through today. Going to try and get through in about half an hour, something like that. But as I said, there is a lot. I'm only half joking when I say, one of my colleagues said to me the other day that if you think you know what's going on with apprenticeships at the moment, then chances are you probably don't. It is very, very fast moving, as we'll see. It's quite complicated. There is a lot of information. And to be perfectly honest, I probably can't cover everything in this webinar. So if there is aspects of it that you're not sure about, do please put the questions in the question pane. I'm quite happy to tackle as many as I can from Ian and Francis, whoever, towards the end. As many as I can, but I will try and get through the basis, good overview of so you know the basis of what's happening with the levy. Sorry, there we go. Right, okay. A very brief overview agenda, just to give you an idea of where we're going, but it's going to break out rather more than this. Can I have a look at the levy reforms as a whole? Because the levy itself is part of a bigger package, and it's important that you understand what the bigger package is, because otherwise a lot of it, to be honest, doesn't really make sense. We'll have a look just to remind ourselves what actually is an apprenticeship in the first place. What does it comprise? Who delivers it? How do you pay for it? And then we'll take as many questions as you can think of at the end. So we're going to move straight on the levy reforms themselves. The apprenticeships generally are at the centre of the work-based learning policy for this government, and they have been actually for previous governments as well. So they've actually been at the centre of policy for good decade, if not longer than that now, actually. You'll have heard, for example, about the 3 million target that the government had introduced. The 3 million target was a target for to start between the last election and when the next election was due, which was 2020, of course. Just to give you an indication, in the previous parliament, we started about 2.4 million apprentices. So there's obviously a bit of a jump there to get to 3 million. But it was obviously, with the election now being called, you know, that all bets are off with regard to that as to moments where we get to. But that just does give you an indication of the numbers that we're talking about and the importance the government are placing on it. Why are apprenticeships important? There is all sorts of research out there to tell you more about this. There's figures from the IMI, for example, that show something like anything up to about a 300% return on investment for employers with regard to their investment in apprenticeships. And some very recent Westminster University research has shown some very marked and significant benefits on earnings for individuals from who've followed even the lowest levels of apprenticeships at level 2. That's a very interesting piece of work. I'm not actually sure it's been published yet, but it will be very shortly. And I've spoken to them and they were able to talk about it. But there really is no doubt apprenticeships are front and centre of the policy. They are very good for individuals. They are very good for employers, any way you look at it. So that means what does it mean for GUAC members? Well, it rather begins to depend on where you're coming from with regard to this. If you're coming from it in terms of what does it mean for your tenants, for example, well, what apprenticeships are doing is they increase earning potential, they increase the skills base, they increase retention in work, and obviously all those things are good. If you've got a career, if you've got a career prospect, if you've got progression, you're going to be settled in housing. Frankly, you're going to be able to pay the rent. This has all got to be good for you and for your tenants. But I know that many of you as housing associations are going to be paying the levy yourself as well. So you need to understand what the levy can do for you as an employer. And from that point of view, it's still beneficial. There is such a return on investment in terms of productivity from people that come through, and again has positive effects in terms of staff retention, absenteeism rates drop, all sorts of things. So it's it's a very, very positive system. We've had apprenticeships in place, of course, for quite some time, but the government have decided, well, they want to make them better. So everything is changing about them, the funding, the content, the design. So everything that you may have known about apprenticeships up to now is basically changing. And as of Monday, the new system kicks in. So I don't have to talk to any more about, well, the current system is this, but we're moving to that. As of Monday, this is the system, and that's basically what I'll be talking to you about today. As I said, talking about the levy in isolation, just the financial levy itself, is really only part of the picture. There is a need to understand a wider view here, because the reforms are very fundamental, are very far-reaching. Ultimately, though, they are designed to put employers in the lead as regards to what is delivered and to whom. On the basis that it's all very well people wanting to do a form of learning, but if there is no work out there for them, if it doesn't actually help them to get on in career, you have to ask, is there a point to that? Now, you may agree there is a point to that outside of just economic responsibility, but that's the line the government are taking. They want this to go right down the line with how does the skills base of the individual affect business and productivity, and that's their starting point for the reforms. So what is an apprenticeship? First thing to say is that your apprentices, any apprentices, can come from your existing workforce. The traditional view of an apprentice is that you need to recruit them from scratch, that they are a young person, age 16 maybe, straight from school, and you're taking them on as a recruit, as an apprentice. That's, of course, perfectly valid, but you are perfectly entitled to take them from your existing workforce. In fact, about 2/3 of apprentices actually are already working for an employer when they're put onto an apprentice, when they're put onto an apprenticeship. So you might have to think you have to recruit somebody new. You don't. What the rules say, however, is that for an apprenticeship to be a valid form of training, it's got to be demonstrated that it's going to teach the person some new skills. You can't just use the apprenticeship to validate what they already have or what they currently do. So they must either be in a new role for which the apprenticeship will help them, or it's going to give them some new skills. You've got to be able to say that by the time they complete the apprenticeship, they will be significantly further on in their learning and skills base from when they started. But providing you can do that, and providing they're employed by you, that's absolutely fine. So whether you take them on, whether on your existing workforce, just make sure that it is going to take someone. Prior learning is also not an issue. Actually, under the rules that are just about to pass, for example, if you're a graduate, you're not allowed to do an apprenticeship, because the view is that a graduate degree, an undergraduate degree, is a certain level of learning, and an apprenticeship would take you down the levels of learning, so therefore you can't do it. The new rules, as from Monday, quite simply is that it's about, is it going to teach you new skills? So if you have a degree in fine art, but you want to do an apprenticeship to be a plumber, then having a degree in fine art is neither here nor there. Actually, the apprenticeship in plumbing is going to teach you a load of new skills, therefore you can do it. So prior learning itself is of no object, providing the learning is materially different. So you're going to be learning something new in your apprenticeship as opposed to the learning that you have currently done. What does an apprenticeship comprise? There's a variety of levels. It starts at level 2, and just as a reminder for that, level 2 is basically the baseline level that you should be able to have the compulsory schooling period with at 16. So they start at level 2 and go up through the system, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, theoretically beyond as well. A level 3 is around about rough equivalent of about an A level. When we're moving into level 4, 5, that sort of area, we're talking undergraduate degree level. When we're talking 6 and 7, we're talking about masters. We're talking about higher degrees and degree apprenticeships at that stage. So there really is an equivalence here. One thing all have in common in law is that they have to last at least 1 year. So an apprenticeship will always be of at least 1 year's duration, usually longer than that. We'll come on talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but usually longer than that, at least a minimum of a year. And you have to have a job in order to do it. You cannot be doing an apprenticeship if you are not employed. So all apprenticeships are predicated on the existence of a contract of employment. One bullet point I didn't put up here, which is just an omission on my part, apologies for that. Apprenticeships have to include an element of off-the-job training. It's defined as 20%. There is some argument about 20% of what, and we can perhaps unpick that a little bit more a little bit later on. But basically, in very, very broad terms, this isn't necessarily true in every case. But the idea is, in a traditional apprenticeship, you might have 5 working days a week, of which one was at college doing a qualification. So that's where it's come from, but actually it doesn't quite work like that anymore, as we'll see. But the rules say 20% off the job training, which basically means away from the pressures of work. So you mustn't be in the front line. You must have a chance to sit and reflect and learn, and you get the idea. But the definition of that is still a little bit hazy at the moment. You're going to hear about 2 types of apprenticeships. You'll hear about frameworks and you'll hear about apprenticeships. You hear about frameworks and you'll hear about standards. Frameworks are the current system of apprenticeships, and what they comprise, they are basically, an apprenticeship framework is, if you like, a basket of qualifications. And if you get those qualifications, then you can be said to have completed an apprenticeship. A framework will normally combine a technical qualification, which might be an HND or something that you would study more or less full-time, or in a classroom at college, for example. It will normally comprise a national vocational qualification, an NVQ, which will test your competence. Actually, you're applying those theoretical skills in the workplace. And there'll be some English and maths qualifications at levels that you will need to reach as well in order to attain all that. Providing you've done all those things, you get all those things, you can be awarded a framework apprenticeship. They're assessed what's known as formatively, which basically means you train, assess as you go along. The list of frameworks that are currently available for delivery is, I assume the slides will be coming out to you, but the link is there. It's on the .gov.uk site. Beg your pardon, I've got a problem getting the words out today. And that will tell you what frameworks are currently available for delivery at any one time. What are standards? Well, standards are now designed to be replacing frameworks. So standards are the new kids on the block. And these are, as they sound like, standards of occupational competencies, which are drawn up by officially sanctioned groups of employers. So the difference will be, whereas, for example, you could say in carpentry, picking one out of the air, a framework might be that you need to get a technical qualification in carpentry, you need to get an NVQ in carpentry, and then you get some English and maths. With the standard, what happens is basically the employers have written out a 2-page thing which said to be a competent carpenter, you need to be able to do this, 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 and this. And if you can do that, then that makes you a carpenter. You have passed the standard, and providing you've got the English and maths elements within that as well, that's fine. So it is slightly different. It's more like a role description. It's not quite, but it is more like a role description. So, for example, in just a ludicrous example with a carpenter, the standard may say, well, provided they can bang a nail in a piece of wood and they know which end of the saw is the pointy bit, then that makes them a competent carpenter. That's about the standard of carpentry I get to, by the way. But provided they can do that, that makes them a competent carpenter. Got your English and maths, fantastic. You've passed the apprenticeship standard. There is a big difference with standards in as much as they're known as undergo what's known as summative assessment, which basically is otherwise known as endpoint assessment, and that means that you train and train and train, and then when you are judged to be ready, you effectively sit what amounts to an exam at the end of it. That's not an exam. It could be a couple of days of observations, it could be interviews, it could be making something, it could be a project, but there is a fixed point at the end at which that assessment is undertaken, the endpoint is undertaken, and you either pass or fail it at that point. So, and that's fairly different to where we are at the moment. Ultimately, there's going to be around about 1,000 plus standards available. There's already something around about 150, 200, something like that, that are currently available. They're on the link, the second link there as well, for apprenticeship standards, so you can see what's available and what's coming in. You are very unlikely not to be able to find a framework or a standard that doesn't fit an occupation that you're looking at, or in your industry. So that's basically what apprenticeships are. Excuse me, just take a drink. Who delivers them? Beg your pardon. The reforms are only providers who are on the register of apprenticeship training providers from Monday can deliver apprenticeships. The link is there. That will tell you. There's been some controversy about this, but that's not for you as employers necessarily to worry about. What you need to look at is have a look at that list and see who's on there. That will tell you who can actually deliver an apprenticeship. You can, if you're an employer, deliver to your own staff if you want to. You might decide that you are best placed to train your staff in this particular framework or standard. That's absolutely fine, but you too will have to be on the register of apprenticeship training providers if you want to be able to do that. And there are certain criteria that you need to go through. You need to demonstrate your financial stability. You need to demonstrate your capacity and capability to train. So you'll need to go through exactly the same process as everybody else if you want to train to your own staff. But if that's what you want to do, you are perfectly able to do it. One key difference where we are at the moment, though, is that with frameworks, your provider can train and assess the apprentice. The government, however, decided they didn't like that. They felt that was a bit too much like providers marking their own work. So with standards, and the standards are coming to replace frameworks, endpoint assessments must be delivered by a different organisation. So you will appoint a lead provider from the register of apprenticeship training providers who will train your apprentice. That lead provider will also subcontract a endpoint assessment organisation on your behalf as an employer. You will have to approve that the selection of that endpoint assessment organisation. So you'll have to agree that it's okay for them to do it, but they oh, beg your pardon, I've got a Facebook thing came up, forgot to shut it down, beg your pardon. But the endpoint assessment must be conducted by a different organisation, but the lead provider will organise that for you. In terms of who are assessment organisations, they are again available on that link. So please, you can go and have a look at that, but your lead provider will take that through that. It's the register of apprenticeship training providers. That's the bit you really need to be looking at. Right, now having done all that, how do you pay for it? We've finally gone heavy bit, but hopefully you begin to understand now why it's important you get a bit more of a wider view of what's going on. The levy is a 0.5% payroll tax, and it's payable by every organisation in the UK. There is, however, a de minimis £15,000 offset. That is to say, if your 0.5% of your annual payroll doesn't amount to £15,000, you don't pay it. So effectively what that means is that the levy is payable by companies who have an annual pay bill of £3 million or more, because £15,000 is 0.5% of £3 million. So if your pay bill is £3 million or more, you'll be paying the levy. If your pay bill is £15,000, it's £3 million or less than £3 million, you won't be making levy payments. You are still in scope for the levy should your pay bill increase, but you won't be paying it until your levy payments would exceed £15,000 a year. It's paid monthly as part of PAYE returns. So the first collections were being made as part of the payroll runs in April. So it's already underway, but the rules actually change and you can start spending the money, as we'll talk about in a second, from Monday. In all, it's due to raise something like £2.4 billion for England on its own. That is an effective doubling of the current funding for apprenticeships. So you can see how seriously this is being taken. There's probably just over £1 billion or something, 1.1 billion, something like that in the system at the moment. We're going way beyond that now, way beyond that, and this is a significant injection of money coming into the system. The levy take as a whole pays for all apprenticeship training in the UK. So I mentioned England earlier, but this is actually England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. It will pay for all of it, but it will only pay for apprenticeship training. It will not pay for anything else. The full apprenticeship funding detail rules, and I won't be able to cover everything, but again on that link. But what you need to know from here on for the next couple of slides is, are you a levied employer or are you a non-levied employer? Because that makes a difference in how the funding works. So let's say you're a levied employer. So that means that you're going to be paying, you've got a pay bill of £3 million or more a year. If you now want to wish to access government funding for apprenticeships, first thing you have to do is register on the Apprenticeship Service, TAS. It will probably be called something else. It's been called about 3 things already. That's the latest name for it. But you need to register on that. You need to set up an account which will attach your payroll returns to HMRC, and they can do whatever they need to do in order to make the levy, to collect the levy from you. Excuse me. This effectively then gives you a dashboard, and that dashboard will show how much levy you have paid on a monthly basis and on an aggregate basis. It will show you how much you have available to spend, because your levy payments last for 2 years from when you pay them. So they will be put in a pot, and they will sit there waiting for you to spend them on apprenticeships for 2 years. After that time, they go into general taxation pot and you lose them. But it will keep track for you of what you've paid, what you've got available to spend. There's also will be some available tools on there which will allow you to have a look and see what frameworks and standards are available, and crucially, who delivers them. So if you're thinking, yes, I would like to perhaps take on a few carpenters, apprentice carpenters, I wonder who delivers that in my area. You can have a look and see what the frameworks, what the standards are that are available for carpenters, and then have a look and see what providers deliver them, and you can make a choice about where you go from there. Everything you pay into the levy is topped up by 10%. So if you pay £1,000 in, you will find that there is actually £1,100 there to spend, because the government put 10% in on top. And the levy is designed to pay for all the training and all the endpoint assessment costs. So if you are a levied employer, actually no, I'll come on to that part in a minute. If the levy pot runs out at any point, you then move into what is called a co-investment model, which we'll look at on the next slide. Basically means that you pay 10% and the government pays the other 90%. So you've paid your levy, that can then be drawn down to pay for your apprenticeships in full until such time as your levy take runs out, at which point you then contribute 10% towards it. So it's really important that you keep track of your levy payments. If you've got a number of apprentices on board, have you got enough coming into your levy pot to make sure that you're going to be able to cover the payments going out over a period of time? Real cash flow issues here that you would need to look at as an employer. Is there enough to pay for what you have committed? Because if you run out at any point, you start paying 10% until such time as you've got the money in there to pay for it. So if you're a levied employer, therefore, what you're doing is you're effectively paying for 100% of your apprenticeships up front. You've got no choice about that. You're just going to pay the money. You can then choose, if you wish to give a provider permission to withdraw funds from your levy pot to pay for it. It's up to you whether or not you actually decide to do that. But if you don't decide to do that, there's no other way of getting that money back, unless you write it off and pass the costs on to your tenants or other customers. But given the return on investment we were talking about earlier, you know, there's certainly a bit of thinking you might have to do before you were to do that. Now, if you're a non-levied employer, so your pay bill is not £3 million a year, it's not as much as that, your apprenticeships are funded through co-investment, which basically means you pay 10% and the government pay 90%. And as I said, that also applies where levied employers have just exhausted their levy fundings. This will change. The apprenticeship, the TAS, is not currently available for non-levied employers. It will become available probably in subsequent years, but it is a slightly different system at the moment. They wanted to get the levied employers sorted out first. So you pay, as a non-levied employer, you take 10% of the negotiated price with the provider. The government pays the other 90%. What's key here is that a provider will not get any money at all until you pay your 10%. Actually, it's not even on an invoice. You have to pay your 10%, and the provider has to be able to show that 10% is in their bank account. And only at that point can they get the rest of the money. So you will find providers will be probably pretty tight with you on things like payment terms and when you pay, because they won't get anything until you've paid your 10%. In fact, until your 10% is in their bank. So that's worth remembering. As with the levied employers, all your providers that you use must be on the register, of apprenticeship training providers. But additionally, for non-levied employers, the provider must have a budget allocation from the Education and Skills Funding Agency to deliver to a non-levied employer. If you're a provider and you're delivering to a levied employer, the money is there because you've paid it. All the money is there in a pot already and it's there to draw on. If you are a non-levied employer, you haven't paid anything into anywhere. So we have to go and get money from somewhere else. We get budgets as providers, we'll get budgets from the SFA. So you need to make sure that your provider, as a non-levied employer, your provider is on the register and they have an allocation to deliver to you, because otherwise nobody's getting paid for anything. Just as an interesting aside, 98% of businesses are non-levied, only 2% are levied. That's 2% is going to raise this £2.4 billion. So as a non-levied employer, you're by no means on your own. How much are the apprenticeships? Well, there are no fixed prices for apprenticeships anymore. You negotiate the price for them like you would for anything else. However, each standard and each framework has been assigned to a price band, which tells you how much government money is available to pay for that training. As you can see from this, it could be anything from £1,500 through to £27,000. That price cap will effectively tell you how much the government thinks a full fat from scratch apprenticeship of this nature should cost. And that can at least help you in guiding what your negotiated price should be with the provider. Because if you know this apprentice is going from scratch, the government is saying, well, we're prepared to take £1,500 for that type of for that type of apprenticeship. So that gives you a bit of a guideline. That price includes not only the training but all the assessment costs. For standards, that's undertaken by a separate endpoint assessment, EPA organisations we talked about earlier, but the price for that has to be agreed between you and the lead provider up front. So they will appoint and contract the organisation for you, but that cost will be in the amount that you negotiate at this point. Ultimately, you can negotiate any price you want above or below the figures that are there. What these figures are telling you is the amount of money the government, the maximum amount of money the government will contribute for that training, either from your levy account or from the provider's non-levy allocation. And ultimately, it will be capped according to which banding that framework or that standard sits in. Might be glad to know it's not all one way. It's not all money going out. There is money coming back to employers in certain circumstances as well. If you are an employer and you have less than 50 staff, then if you take on a 16 to 18-year-old apprentice or a 19 to 25-year-old apprentice who has an education and healthcare plan or who is a former care leaver, then they're actually fully funded and you don't pay anything. You don't pay anything from your levy pot. You don't pay the 10%. You don't pay anything if you have less than 50 staff. All 16 to 18-year-olds, additionally, on top of that, all 16 to 18-year-olds, all 90 to 25-year-olds EHC care leavers also attract £1,000 payments to both the employer and the provider. And that's basically to cover some of what's perceived as the additional costs of perhaps mentoring and looking after and supporting 16 to 18-year-olds and EHC care leaver apprentices in the workplace as opposed to anybody else. So actually, if you are an employer with less than 50 starts and you take on a 16 to 18-year-old, not only is it free, but you actually get paid. You actually get paid £1,000 and the provider will get paid £1,000 as well. Also, very important to note that the English and maths qualifications that are required to fulfill the apprenticeship are not paid by the employer up to level 2. So very broadly, if the apprentice has not got their GCSE in maths or English, then you don't have to pay for it as the employer. The government will pay for it. If they're required to study maths and English to a higher level, you will have to pay for that as part of the negotiated price, but not otherwise. So the basic compulsory period of education, that funding is covered. Why do they do this? Because for reasons, some technical reasons won't necessarily go into at the moment, unless you ask. The levy does have a tendency to emphasize the recruitment of older apprentices and apprentices at higher level. And the worry is that that may mean that 16 to 18-year-old apprentices, apprentices with learning disabilities or physical disabilities, care leavers, might become much less attractive to employers. So therefore, they want to make sure that there's an incentive to take that cohort on. So as an employer, as a housing association employer, that's worth knowing, but it's also worth knowing if you're going to support your tenants as well. So if you have younger or EHC or care leaver tenants and you're going to help them to find apprenticeships, for example, it's well worth knowing they will attract extra funding as they go through the system. Well, so as you can see, there is a ton of information there for you, and you know it would be very glib of me to say, well, that's not the half of it really, but hopefully that's a real overview of where we sit with regard to the apprenticeship system at the moment. That's the system as it's going to be operating from May 2017. It's designed to take account of the needs of employers. It puts them in the forefront of the design and the funding. It doubles the amount of money that's being put out there by the government to support apprentices being taken on. They are undoubtedly, I know it's easy to say, well, he would say this, wouldn't he? He's representing the providers, but this is true. Apprenticeships are undoubtedly an excellent return on any investment you make in them by the country, by you as employers, and certainly worthwhile for the individuals concerned. And the policy rationale is very clear. The trade-off is now that whereas you may have been used in the past to apprenticeships being more or less free to you, they're now not. If you're a levied employer, you're basically paying for all of it. If you're a non-levied employer, you're paying 10% of it. But now you are going to be paying for this because these are, the government is saying, these are really good for your business. You should be investing in these. And that's at the basis, as I said, of what the whole of this reform area is about. But to be honest, even if it's 90%, you know, if you were being offered something else that had such a great benefit for your business and it was 90% subsidized, you'd be saying, well, that looks like a brilliant return to me. It shouldn't be any different with apprenticeships. So I realize there's been a massive amount of information there for you to take in. I hope I've made some kind of sense. Do please drop me questions through to my email or go onto our website. We've got a lot of resources there that will hopefully take you through some of the intricacies of this as well. But I'll leave it there for the moment. I'll hand back to Ian and Francis. If there are any questions coming in, happy to take them. And thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Paul. Could you stop sharing your screen? That'd be great. Okay, thanks very much. That was a fairly comprehensive, well, very comprehensive explanation of that. And please, if you've got any questions, type it up. We've got about 20 minutes left before we have to conclude this. We've had a couple of questions already. Tahira said he's actually emailed me as well, not just put it up on the chat box, so he's quite keen to have this question answered. Is this scheme, the apprenticeship levy, for everyone, or is it just for younger people, Paul?
No, it's open to absolutely everybody. That's the key thing about it. What the government is saying is that they believe that apprenticeships are a very worthwhile investment for any company, and it's therefore for that company to decide who would best benefit from them and who would make the most return on productivity and economic productivity for that company. It means you want to take a swathe of older workers and put them on apprenticeships. That's absolutely fine, as long as the starting point of the apprenticeship will take them a long way from the starting point. There will be significant new skills, that there's new learning, or it's a new role, or something of that nature. Yep, absolutely. It's any age is involved. Worth bearing in mind, though, with this employer apprentice incentives we was talking about just now, there is actually an incentive in the system really to take on older apprentices, and that's why the government have put in these incentives for younger people, to make sure that younger people don't lose out and that those opportunities for social mobility are still there.
Okay, and Tahira actually sent me an email. We've asked a couple of extra questions in that as well. One of his questions is, in order to help his own supply chain, he wants to know, can you find out how much an organisation needs to contribute? And I suppose that leads to another question, which I think on the government website it was raising questions, is where you can take the money from in your own budget in order to start paying the levy. I mean, do you want to respond to that, Paul?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. If you're saying where do you pay the levy from in your own budget, that's going to be an individual company's decision to make how they take that. I mean, some will decide. One of the arguably less attractive aspects of the levy may be that there are companies that have got big training budgets at the moment that deal with all sorts of things. They deal with traineeships, and they deal with work experience, work placement, all sorts of lovely, interesting things. And now they've got to pay a 0.5% apprenticeship tax. That's what it actually comes down to. So a number of them we know are already saying, well, we're not going to pay that on top of doing all this other stuff, and we can only get that tax back if we do apprenticeships. So therefore, we'll stop doing that other stuff, and we'll just pull it back, and that will effectively pay the apprenticeship levy tax, and we'll just turn it all into apprenticeships, sort of a process of apprenticization. So it's really down to the company itself as to where it pays it from. It could, if it wanted to, just put all its prices up to its customers and just not take any apprentices on at all, but I think that'd be a bit self-defeating. Can I just ask though, Francis, the question about the supply chains, could you just run through that one again?
Yeah, sure. He basically said, how can you calculate how much an organisation needs to contribute so he can work out what he needs to do for his organisation?
Oh, I see. Okay. HMRC will probably have been in touch already. Well, they will have been in touch already if you're in scope to pay the levy. In actual fact, the offset is the level is £3 million. And what they were saying on the HMRC website is that if they projected that your payroll was liable to be 2.8 million or higher, then they were getting in touch last year in order to say, well, there is a possibility that you might tip over into it, so can we just set this system up? If they've not been in touch with your payroll department, chances are you're probably not going to be levied.
Yeah, I mean, Tahira says that they're working with their supply chain to encourage them to take their residents into the workforce, and he or she, so I don't know if it's he or she, Tahira, maybe you can say, you're working with them to see if you can support them, and also asks the standard that you mentioned, how often does that get updated, Paul?
I'll take that one first. The standards are now owned, in quotes, by the Institute for Apprenticeships. So the Institute for Apprenticeships, which is newly formed, has taken ownership of all standards, all frameworks, and they're responsible for when standards need to be updated. That will vary. Something like an IT standard, for example, will require very regular updating because technology moves so fast. Some other areas might not require it. So it really depends on the particular standard. But if you go to those links on the slide deck, it will tell you what standards are in scope at the moment and when it is due to be reviewed. But it varies wildly with each individual standard or framework. Just with regard to the supply chain point, if you are a levy payer, at the moment, the levy that you pay can only be used to deliver apprenticeships to your own employee one way or the other. However, in future years, and we think next year, 2018, we think what will happen is that there will be a system in place whereby if you wish to, you can transfer part of your own levy to your supply chain to allow them to take on apprentices in the supply chain by accessing your levy pot. You can't do that this year. The facility isn't there, but that is coming down the line. So keep an eye on that.
Okay, and Emma has asked a question as well. She says, is the employer incentive £1,000 payment available if you are an employer provider?
Yes.
Well, that was a very simple, quick answer.
Yep.
Wow, that took me that took me by surprise. Okay, look, we'll go to the next one as well. Chris Adams, there's question and answer icon at the bottom, and some people are typing in that as well. Chris Adams has, and he says, to utilise the levy, has there got to be a guaranteed job at the end of the apprenticeship?
Not as no. There has to be, you have to be in a job to study the apprenticeship, but you don't, in the same way that you could say, for example, you have a temporary contract of employment, let's say for 18 months. As long as that 18-month contract of employment is sufficient for the individual to complete the apprenticeship, then that is absolutely fine. What you can't do is take somebody on for a 6-month contract of employment and then put them on a standard that lasts 18 months because they've got no way of completing the apprenticeship with the job. So they have to line up together. But I mean, there are some really, really excellent examples of blue chip industries. British Airways, for example, what they do is they take their apprentices basically on payroll, so they become in jobs, they put them all over the company, they complete their apprenticeships, but at the end of that contract of employment, basically those individuals are then given the chance to pitch themselves to different parts of the company to take a job. Now, the vast majority of them are taken in parts of British Airways on employment, but not all of them are. So the key thing is actually, in order to do the apprenticeship, you need to be in work, and the period of work they are contracted for needs to be sufficient for them to complete the standard or framework that they're on. That's the rules.
Okay, and Ian, I think you had a question you wanted to bring up here as well, didn't you?
Yeah, thanks, Francis, and thank you, Paul. It's only come up to me quite recently. It sounds like a really great opportunity for existing employees within our organisations to, if we want to sign up to begin an apprenticeship qualification. Is there an implication, or is the 20% requirement potentially an implication in terms of planning the numbers of our employees that may start an apprenticeship using the levy funding?
The 20% requirement is still the matter of a lot of debate at the moment, and I think there's going to be a lot of suck it and seeing going on about how they define that. The government's quite clear. The intention was that they wanted to make sure with an apprenticeship that it wasn't just about somebody just working and working and working and working. That's all they do. They wanted them to have the chance to go and do some reflective study where they could sit down, they could be taught, if necessary, get a qualification. And incidentally, not all standards have qualifications in them. That's another key point. All frameworks do. Not all standards have qualifications in them. And that's part of the issue about off-the-job training and this 20%, because if there isn't a qualification that's involved, what does the off-the-job training involve? And you start to get into some rather messy areas about that. In general terms, what needs to happen for 20% training is that you need to be able to demonstrate that there is off-the-job training going on, that it's away from the workplace, isn't necessary, or away from the pressures of work. So it might be at their workplace, but they're not being expected to work while they're doing it. So you could do distance learning, for example, or you could have somebody sitting next to you talking you through how to run a spreadsheet or whatever it is, but it's not a direct part of the working day. It has to be in contracted working hours. So you can't send them off home and say, well, when you get home tonight, log on and do a bit of homework. That won't count. English and maths won't count towards it as well. That's another area where which is a bit contentious. But what you have to do really is just to define, or get your provider particularly to define a plan that you are happy demonstrates that I've got 20% of something which is off the job training and which meets the intent of the policy. It is that I still think there's a lot of movement on this one. There's quite a lot that's not ready. For example, at the moment, I know that the plan is that policemen will be going through a police apprenticeship in future years, which is great. You know, no reason in itself why not. But there is a requirement for 20% off the job training. So that effectively means that 1 day in 5, policemen aren't out on the streets; they're sitting in a classroom somewhere. Is that really what we want? And is that really the best way to teach a policeman how to do a job? Yeah. Well, the Army and the MOD say no, it's not. They've got different rules. So things may change yet. So this 20% need to watch that. I would say as an employer, I think, unless you're an employer provider, in which case you're going to be very involved in it, but as an employer, I would say it's just something you need to quiz your provider about. How are they going to cover this? How are you going to make sure that your back is covered, that your levy is being drawn down correctly and according to the rules? How do they define 20% off the job training? How are they going to track it? That's really the key thing as an employer.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I just see that recently that Christchurch University got the contract for the apprenticeship scheme for the London Transport Police. So you're right. I mean, the police are doing that. We're getting very close to the end now, but can I ask you, Paul? I mean, if you know, an employer runs into problems and they're not quite sure what to do, what support systems are there available for those employers to be able to get the help they need?
Well, naturally, I would say by all means click onto our website. We'll be able to we'll give you as much information as we can. There is a fair amount of resource on there. However, I would point you to our website, which is called Future Apprenticeships. Can't say it. Future Apprenticeships. It's a long-running program that's been funded by the Education and Training Foundation. We play a very large part in it, but along with a number of other trade bodies as well. And this provides there's an absolute ton of resource on there for providers, for employers. There's webinars, there's resource materials, there's teaching packs, there's all sorts of stuff on there. And it's actually targeted at a practitioner level. So it's not just about you as an organisation, it's actually about how to teach your staff about apprenticeships, how they can support apprentices. There's a lot of information on there. So have a look at our website, have a look at the Future Apprenticeships website as well. Francis, can I just pick up as well? I've just seen a chat come in from Tahira. Again, on the standards list, there doesn't seem to be many level 6 to 7s. No, there isn't at the moment, but you are going to see a lot coming through soon. In particular, the universities are very, very interested in development of higher degrees, higher apprenticeships and degree apprenticeships. So there's a lot in development and there's a lot of talk going on in that area at the moment. So there's not many, there are a few, there's not many, but there will be over the next year. I think there's going to be a lot more coming through shortly. So do keep an eye on that list.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. Maybe, Ian, you could have the last word. And while you're doing that, maybe, Paul, if you wanted to type in the link to your site where people can get the help you mentioned in the chat box, that'd be great. So, Ian, if you remember to unmute your microphone. I mean, tell me, I mean, for your members, for GUAC, the new approach to apprenticeship that the government's having, and some people say it's long overdue, provides a great opportunity for social landlords, doesn't it?
Well, what it makes me think listening to Paul, and it's brilliant that we now know as much as it is possible to know about the Apprenticeship Levy, and this has been provided for to give us a chance, members, to learn. But what I'm sat here thinking, listening to Paul, is if we are only really now beginning to understand this, how do we that are involved in getting customers into work and into apprenticeships get that information out? You're making me think we've got a piece of work here that's give us a chance with AELP in order to give a good message and get our customers to benefit from the changes, you know. And we're all thinking about the supply chain. We're all thinking about opportunities for employment within our own organisations as well. I don't know. I just think it's been brilliant to get this today, to learn the place that we're at, and the thing that it leads us next is how do we get this out to customers?
Okay. Thanks, thanks, Ian. Yeah, I mean, I think it is a great opportunity, and I think this webinar has been incredibly useful because, Paul, you've given us a lot of information, and you've typed in the link to the website and so on, where people can get the extra support. I'm sure lots of people are going to look at this as an opportunity, and they're going to need that help, and they're going to need that support. So, thank you both for being on here, and Paul for your, you know, comprehensive presentation of this, and I'm sure if people have problems, you'll be willing to take that up with them, and they'll be able to contact you. So that's great. And thank you all for your comments and your questions. That's been great as well. This webinar has been recorded, and I know it will go out on the GUAC website, so you know people will be able to see this in perpetuity, and will be able to get the information again, and you'll be able to look at it again as well, and you'll get sent a link to that by GUAC, so you'll be able to see it. So thank you all very much for joining us.